You don't belong here." The words hit Leia like a slap, freezing her in her seat. Bethany Caldwell, a woman in expensive designer clothes, was standing over her, screaming, "I want her out of my seat now." Her voice was so loud that even the flight attendants started to shift uncomfortably. The entire first-class cabin was now watching this confrontation unfold. Leia, a 16-year-old girl just trying to enjoy a vacation with her father, was suddenly the target of an ugly attack. But what Bethany didn't know was that Leia's father wasn't just any man, he was one of the most powerful figures in the FBI, a man whose presence could turn the whole plane upside down in a heartbeat. Hello friends, if you new here then don't forget to hit subscribe button, and if you like then hit the like button also, and don't forget to tell me in the comments where you from watching this video. The humiliation was raw. Leia's heart raced, not from fear, but from the injustice of it all. She was just trying to hold it together, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone under the seat, unsure whether she should reach out to her dad. The anger building inside her wasn't about the seat, it was about being treated like she didn't matter. She was done being quiet. Bethany thought she had all the power, until a name was dropped that would flip her world on its head. The story that unfolds next will make you question everything about power, privilege, and the truth behind it. This is real-life stories, new, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when Leia's father steps in. Don't forget to subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Leia Bradford had always prided herself on her composure. At 16, she had already learned to navigate the world with a quiet confidence, one that was forged through years of perseverance and a life that was often filled with solitude. Her father, Xavier Bradford, was the type of man whose job consumed most of his time. As one of the youngest division chiefs in the FBI, heading counterterrorism operations, his days were filled with classified meetings, late-night briefings, and the constant pressure of national security on his shoulders. But this trip, this flight to Bali, was supposed to be different. Xavier had promised his daughter 2 weeks without interruption. No calls. No agents. No work. Just them. A chance to rebuild the connection they had lost due to his demanding career. Leia had never been one to complain about his absence. She had learned early on that the sacrifices he made were for a larger purpose, even though it left a void in her heart. But for the first time in a long time, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, this vacation would be different. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Leia gazed out the window, her thoughts drifting from the chaos of her life to the peace she hoped would come. Her father, sitting beside her, had even tried to ease her worries by engaging in their usual pre-flight routine, quizzing her on the emergency exits, reminding her to switch her phone to airplane mode. It was small, seemingly insignificant moments like these that had kept their bond strong, despite the distance. But this moment, this simple flight, was about to shatter any sense of calm Leia had left. She was not prepared for the attack that would come her way. It started with a voice, sharp, loud, and shrill, "I don't care what her ticket says. This seat is mine, and I want her out of it now." The words rang through the cabin, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Leia froze. Her hand instinctively tightened around her boarding pass as she turned her gaze toward the source of the chaos. Bethany Caldwell, a woman with the kind of expensive designer clothes that screamed privilege, was standing in the aisle. Her face was flushed with irritation, and her voice carried an edge of entitlement that Leia immediately recognized. It wasn't the kind of confrontation she was used to. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about something much deeper, something uglier. Leia had heard words like this before, at her private school, in the hallways of country clubs, at academic competitions. People like Bethany, who thought that wealth and status gave them the right to dismiss others. But this time, the sting was different. This time, it wasn't just an insult aimed at her, it was a blatant. An attempt to strip her of her dignity. To make her feel less than. Unworthy of the space she occupied. Leia's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly recovered. She had learned from her father not to let moments like these shake her. I'm in 3A, she said, holding up her boarding pass calmly. There was no hint of fear in her voice, just the simple truth. This was her seat. This was where she belonged. Bethany snatched the boarding pass from her hand with an air of condescension, examining it as if it might somehow prove her wrong. But it didn't. Leia's boarding pass clearly stated that 3A was hers. Still, Bethany didn't let go of her anger. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath, her face reeling with frustration. I always get a window seat. This is my seat. Get up. Leia, holding her composure, replied, No, ma'am. This is my assigned seat. I'm not leaving. She had already rehearsed this in her mind 100 times, how to stand her ground, how to face down the ugliness without flinching. But as she spoke, she couldn't shake the tightness in her chest, the feeling that this was more than just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a woman who wanted her seat. This was a person who believed she had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. The words that followed hit harder than anything she had anticipated. People like you don't usually fly first class. Cruel words ignite tense cabin clash. Bethany sneered, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant to be overheard only by Leia. It was an accusation. A judgment. One that cut straight to the core of everything Leia had fought so hard to rise above. The implication was clear, a young black girl didn't belong in first class. She didn't belong in this space. She didn't belong among people like Bethany. It was the kind of comment Leia had endured all her life. But each time, it still stung, reminding her that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how successful she became, there were always people like Bethany who saw her as less than. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, the hostility. She wanted to say something. Wanted to fight back. To tear apart the judgment Bethany had thrown at her like an insult. But instead, Leia turned her gaze back to the window. She didn't need to dignify it with a response. Her father had taught her better than that. The words that stung were nothing more than the hollow sound of someone's deep insecurity. Bethany's insults continued to fill the air, but Leia remained silent, refusing to let her emotions take over. Instead, she reached for her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she debated whether to text her father. The situation was escalating. And while she knew he wouldn't be able to help in this exact moment, he was in the middle of an important briefing, there was a part of her that felt desperate to reach out. But she hesitated. Her father had promised her 2 weeks of uninterrupted time. The last thing she wanted was to pull him into this. But Bethany wasn't going to let up. She called for the flight attendant, her voice rising in anger. Flight attendant, she barked again, as though the staff were at her beck and call. Leia's heart sank as she heard the footsteps of the attendant approaching, preparing herself for what was next. Would they side with the angry, entitled woman who clearly believed she was above everyone else? Or would they listen to the truth? The flight attendant, a woman named Madison, arrived quickly, her professional demeanor a sharp contrast to Bethany's rage. Madison's smile was calm, practiced, but Leia could see the way her eyes flickered with the recognition of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a simple seat dispute. There was more at play here. Something darker. Something that made the atmosphere in the cabin shift uncomfortably. I need this girl removed, Bethany spat, the words dripping with venom. She doesn't belong in first class. I'm a paying customer. I demand she be moved. Now. Madison's voice was steady as she responded, I'll need to check both boarding passes. Leia handed hers over immediately, her hand never shaking, though her heart beat faster with every passing moment. This was happening. There was no turning back now. As Madison examined the boarding passes, the tension in the cabin continued to grow. Some passengers were now openly watching, their phones discreetly raised to capture the confrontation. Others were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Everyone in that cabin felt the weight of what was happening, and no one seemed willing to stop it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Madison turned to Bethany. "Miss Bradford is in her assigned seat, 3A, she said, her voice calm and controlled. "You are in 3C, the aisle seat. There's been no mistake. Your seat is across the aisle." Bethy's face flushed a bright crimson. "This is ridiculous," she screamed, the words harsh and unforgiving. "I specifically requested a window seat. This is unacceptable. I always get a window seat. I'm not sitting in that seat." But even as her voice grew louder, even as her frustration continued to spill over, Leah remained silent. She had been through worse. She had dealt with people like Bethany before. And despite the humiliation, despite the weight of the attack, Leah wasn't going to let it break her. She refused to. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about respect. And in that moment, Leah made a decision. She wasn't going to back down. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Even though Leah had remained calm in the face of Bethy's accusations, a tight knot had formed in her stomach. She wasn't used to being the target of such blatant hostility, especially not in a place where she should have felt safe. On a plane where all passengers were supposed to be treated equally. But here, in this moment, it felt as though everything around her was conspiring to remind her that the world wasn't always fair. Leah's gaze remained fixed on the window, but her mind was racing. Was she wrong to not back down? Was it worth fighting for a seat that should have been hers in the first place? The more Bethany raged, the more Leah felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. It was no longer about the seat. Bethy's relentless attack was an attempt to tear down Leah's dignity. To push her out of a space where she had just as much right to be as anyone else. But then something changed. A shift in the air. An unspoken tension that was now palpable, even to the other passengers who had been silently watching. The reality of what was happening was starting to dawn on everyone in the cabin. This wasn't just about a passenger dispute. It was about entitlement. It was about a woman who had been given everything, yet still believed she could take whatever she wanted, no matter who stood in her way. And it was about Leah, a teenager who had already had to fight for her place in this world and wasn't going to let anyone strip that from her without a fight. Bethy's fury was only intensifying. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she spat, her voice high-pitched and furious. "I demand to speak to the captain now. I want her removed from my seat immediately. This is a disgrace." Madison, the flight attendant, had already been on the verge of stepping in. She had heard Bethy's complaints and had witnessed Leah's composed response. The facts were simple. Both passengers had valid boarding passes. But the way Bethany had treated Leah, the way she was treating everyone around her, spoke volumes about her sense of superiority. Madison had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something in the way Bethany was handling this that felt different. This wasn't just a case of someone being annoyed about a seating mix-up. This was something far darker. With a slight sigh, Madison turned and made her way down the aisle, moving with purpose. The silence around her was heavy, thick with the discomfort of everyone in the cabin. People shifted in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable, others pretending not to notice. But their eyes betrayed them. They were all watching. And they were all waiting to see how this would unfold. Captain Michael Harrington, a veteran pilot with over 30 years of experience, emerged from the cockpit. His presence was immediately commanding, the kind of man who had seen it all in his long career. But even he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He sensed it in the way the passengers were behaving, in the thickening tension that had nothing to do with the flight itself. This wasn't just about a seat. This was something personal. "Ladies, what seems to be the problem?" Captain Harrington asked, his tone authoritative, attempting to break the tension with calm professionalism. Bethany, already teetering on the edge of hysteria, seized the opportunity. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with false relief. "This girl has taken my seat. I've been asking her to move, and the flight attendant refuses to help me. I demand she be removed. I have a window seat assigned to me, and she's in my seat, making my flight uncomfortable. I don't know what kind of service this is, but this is unacceptable." Captain Harrington raised an eyebrow, immediately sensing the obvious escalation in Bethany's behavior. He had seen all kinds of passengers in his career, but rarely one acting with such blatant disregard for the rules. He already knew this wasn't about inconvenience, it was about something far more insidious. He turned to Madison, who had been quietly standing by. "I understand the situation, Captain," Madison explained. "The young lady in 3A, Leah Bradford, has a valid boarding pass. She's in the correct seat. Miss Caldwell, on the other hand, is assigned to 3C, the aisle seat. There's been no mix-up, and Miss Bradford has the right to remain where she is." Bethany, counting on her self-proclaimed power to get what she wanted, was not about to back down. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she spat, her face flushed with anger. "I've been traveling for years, and I always get a window seat. You don't understand what it's like when people like her are in your space." The word stung. Leah's breath caught in her throat. For a brief moment, the implication hung in the air, the suggestion that she didn't belong in this space, that she was somehow less than the other passengers. The hurt came quick, but Leah fought to suppress it. She had learned not to let moments like this define her. Instead, she forced herself to focus, on the conversation, on what was happening around her. She would not let Bethany's words break her. Captain Harrington, still calm, looked at Bethany with a quiet authority. "Miss Caldwell, I understand your frustration, but the seat assignments are final. You are in 3C. If you are unhappy with your assigned seat, I can check for other accommodations once boarding is complete." Bethany's face contorted with frustration. She wasn't used to being told no. "You don't understand," she insisted. "I'm married to Raymond Caldwell, Assistant Director of the Department of Justice. I will not sit next to her. This is completely unacceptable. I demand another seat. You have no idea who I am." Captain Harrington paused, taking in Bethany's words. He had heard these kinds of claims before, the ones people made when they believed their connections could bend the rules. But the mention of Raymond Caldwell, a high-ranking official in the Department of Justice, piqued his interest. "I understand, Miss Caldwell," Captain Harrington said, his tone even. "But the policy remains the same, regardless of your connections. We will not move another passenger who is in their correct seat. If you would like, I can check with the flight crew to see if there is any other available seating." The words stung Bethany more than they should have. She had always relied on her status, her husband's power, to get what she wanted. And in this moment, as her demands were met with polite resistance, something inside her began to unravel. She was used to people catering to her. Used to her name opening doors. Used to getting her way. But now, this teenage girl, this other person in her mind, was standing her ground. And Bethany couldn't understand. Why? She had always been able to manipulate situations to her favor. Why was this one so different? As the flight attendant stepped away to make arrangements, Bethy's voice rose again, now tinged with desperation. "You have no idea what this will cost you," she hissed at Captain Harrington. "My husband can have your job. This is not how we treat people like me. You'll regret this." Leah, feeling the full weight of Bethy's wrath, instinctively reached for her phone. She thought about texting her father. The desire to involve him, to have him fix this, was strong. But she knew it wasn't the right thing to do. She didn't want to burden him. Not now. This was her battle, not his. Her father had promised her 2 weeks of uninterrupted time, and Leah wasn't about to ruin that promise over something as trivial as a seat on a plane. Still, her fingers hovered over the screen as she considered whether to send the message. She quickly shook her head and put the phone down, deciding that she could handle this on her own. What happened next, though, was something neither Leia nor Bethany could have anticipated. As the confrontation reached its peak, as Bethy's anger grew louder and her threats grew more pointed, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. The quiet murmur of passengers who'd been watching suddenly stopped. They all seemed to sense that something bigger was about to happen. And it did. The silence in the cabin felt almost suffocating now. Every head seemed turned toward the altercation unfolding in real time, though no one dared to speak. The tension had thickened so much that it was almost palpable, like the heavy hum of an aircraft in mid-flight, where every vibration seemed magnified. Passengers who had once pretended not to notice now stared openly at the confrontation, their phones pointed surreptitiously to capture the escalating drama. What had begun as a trivial dispute over a seat had now grown into something far more significant. Something that would shape not just Leia's journey, but the lives of everyone involved. Bethany Caldwell's frustration had reached a fever pitch. She had tried every tactic she knew, demanding, threatening, invoking her husband's name. Nothing had worked. Leia, calm and composed, refused to be intimidated. Every word, every insult, had been deflected with the precision of someone who had been forced to grow up faster than most teenagers. But this wasn't just about pride. It was about principle. Leia had learned from her father, standing firm in the face of injustice was not just a choice, it was a necessity. Her hands still clenched around her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. Part of her wanted to send that message to her father. But another part of her knew that this moment, this confrontation, was something she needed to handle herself. She was no longer just the daughter of a powerful man. She was a young woman who had the right to stand her ground, regardless of who stood before her. Bethany, still unaware of who Leia truly was, had become increasingly volatile. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she screamed again, her face flushed with rage. "I am married to Raymond Caldwell, Assistant Director of the Department of Justice. You don't know who you're messing with. I'll have you fired, both of you." Her voice, high-pitched and trembling with anger, echoed throughout the cabin. But the moment those words left her mouth, everything changed. Leia's pulse quickened, but not out of fear. This time, it was a shift. A surge of realization. She had already known who Bethany was. What kind of person she was. She'd already known that the woman was going to throw around her status and her name in an attempt to force everyone around her to bow down. But what Bethany didn't know, and what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that the person she was now humiliating and threatening, Leia Bradford, was not just any teenager. The sudden stillness in the cabin was shattered when the sound of a door opening filled the air. Heads turned. Instinctively, passengers leaned forward in their seats. A tall figure emerged from the front of the plane, moving through the aisle with the kind of quiet authority that made people take notice. It was as if the air around him thickened with his presence, as though the entire cabin instinctively knew that something major was about to unfold. Leia didn't have to look twice to know who it was. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man stepping into the aisle. It was her father, Xavier Bradford. The moment his eyes met hers, something shifted. Leia's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with him. For a fleeting second, she was reminded of all the sacrifices he had made, of all the times he had been absent in her life, of all the times his job had kept him away when she needed him the most. But today, in this moment, he wasn't just her father, he was something else. Someone with the power to shift the dynamics of the entire room. Someone who could make everything fall back into place. Xavier's eyes, usually so calm and measured, were now fixed on the scene unfolding before him. As he walked down the aisle, his steps were deliberate, his expression impassive, but his presence alone sent ripples through the cabin. He didn't need to say a word yet, but the subtle tension in his movements was enough to make everyone aware that he was in control. Bethany, still caught in her tirade, had no idea what was happening, until Xavier's voice cut through the air, low and commanding, "Is there a problem here?" The words, delivered with such quiet authority, instantly silenced the room. It was as though the entire atmosphere had changed in that moment. The passengers, who had been watching the drama unfold with growing curiosity, now sat frozen. The shift was palpable. Xavier Bradford's very presence commanded respect, both because of who he was and because of the quiet confidence that radiated from him. It wasn't the kind of confidence that needed to shout or demand, it was the kind that simply was. Bethy's eyes widened in confusion, her tirade momentarily interrupted. "What? Who are you?" she stammered, her voice faltering. She looked up at Xavier, but there was no recognition in her eyes. She was still caught up in her own anger, in her own sense of entitlement. She had no idea who she was speaking to. "I believe you know my name," Xavier replied evenly, his voice still quiet but laced with a subtle edge. "Even if you don't recognize my face." Bethy's confusion deepened, but the moment the name Xavier Bradford lingered in the air, something changed. The recognition began to dawn on her. She was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation, but by then it was too late. Xavier had already taken control of the room, and now the consequences of her actions were unfolding before her in real time. Xavier's gaze shifted to Captain Harrington, who stood beside him now, fully aware of the situation. "Captain," Xavier said with a nod, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm sure you'll agree that Miss Bradford here is in her assigned seat, as per her boarding pass." Bethy's face drained of color as the realization hit her like a physical blow. She was no longer in control of this situation. She had spent the last several minutes using her husband's name as a weapon, trying to manipulate everyone around her into doing her bidding. But she had no idea that the person she had been bullying, the person she had dismissed as someone like her, was the daughter of one of the most powerful figures in the FBI. The weight of her mistake settled on her like a ton of bricks. Her breath caught in her throat and her words stumbled. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." Xavier's expression remained impassive, but the sharpness in his eyes was unmistakable. "You know my name now," he said slowly, "and you know who my daughter is." He paused for a moment, his gaze steady, making sure his words landed with the full impact they were meant to have. "What's been happening here isn't." Passengers, who had been watching with a mixture of unease and curiosity, now felt the weight of what was unfolding. It wasn't just about a seat dispute. It was about entitlement meeting its match. It was about the raw ugliness of prejudice colliding with the quiet power of justice. And in this moment, everyone in that cabin knew that what happened next would leave a lasting impression. Bethy's face twisted with a mix of fear and disbelief. "I didn't mean. I was just upset. I didn't know," her voice faltered, no longer the confident, entitled woman who had stormed down the aisle just moments ago. The power dynamics had shifted irreparably. The person she had dismissed as insignificant had turned out to be far more important than she could have ever imagined. Xavier didn't allow her excuses to take hold. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said firmly. "What matters is how you treat others. And what you did to my daughter is unforgivable." Bethy's shoulders slumped, her defiance fading into shame. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she was being confronted with the consequences of her behavior, and she couldn't escape it. Xavier turned to Leia, his daughter, and in that moment, their eyes met. There was no need for words. In the depths of his gaze, Leia saw not just the father she had missed so much, but the man who had spent his life standing up for what was right. His eyes conveyed a simple message: "You've done well. You didn't need me to fight this battle for you. You've shown your strength." For Leia, the weight of that acknowledgement was enough to steady her. She had faced down injustice, not with rage, but with dignity. And in this moment, she had been proven right. She belonged here. She had earned her place. No one, not even someone as powerful as Bethany Caldwell, could take that away from her. As the plane continued its journey, the once tense cabin now felt strangely calm. Leia sat quietly beside her father, Xavier, processing everything that had just happened. Bethany had been escorted off the plane, her arrogance stripped away as quickly as her pride had crumbled. Leia's gaze flickered to her father. He had remained calm, almost detached through the entire ordeal, but now, as their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding between them. "You didn't need me to step in, did you?" Xavier's voice was gentle, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes. "You handled that situation perfectly." Leia's lips curled into a slight smile, the weight of her victory settling into her chest. The humiliation she had endured earlier had been turned into a moment of quiet strength. She hadn't needed to shout or demand anyone's attention. She had stood her ground, calmly, confidently, and in the end, it was Bethany who had to walk away with nothing but the sting of her own failure. The truth was simple: no one, no matter how much power or privilege they had, could push someone out of their rightful place without facing the consequences. And today, Leia had witnessed it firsthand. Bethy's attempt to degrade her had backfired spectacularly. Xavier didn't need to throw his weight around to make things right. He didn't need to be the one to fight her battles. It was Leia's quiet defiance that had led to Bethy's downfall. The moment was a powerful reminder that dignity and integrity are often the strongest weapons you can carry. And in this case, it wasn't just about who was more powerful. It was about who stood firm in the face of injustice and emerged victorious. The flight continued, but for Leia, the rest of the journey was about more than just reaching Bali. It was about owning her strength, realizing her worth, and knowing that no one, no matter how entitled, could ever take that from her.